Welcome everyone who's joining us for this online discussion on India's youth in the coming decade. I'm Pushkar, Director of the International Center Goa, a bipartisan ideational organization based out of Donapaula, Goa. Donapaula is a suburb in Goa, and we are located there. I'm delighted to welcome our very accomplished panelists and would like to thank them for making time to be part of this discussion. It's a very interesting panel in the sense that our three panelists come from three very different areas. And let me begin with a very, very quick introduction of each one of them. We have with us Maheshwar Perry, who is the founder and chairman of Careers 360. Mahesh is an entrepreneur and is a qualified CA, CMA, and ACS, and previously worked with the Outlook Group of magazines for about 17 years and headed it for more than 10 years as president and publisher. Dr. Radhika Kapoor is an economist and a fellow at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, or ICRIER, as it is called. Radhika has a master's degree from Cambridge and a PhD from the London School of Economics, and worked earlier at the Planning Commission and at the ILO, International Labour Organization, Geneva. Finally, we have Vivan Marwaha, consultant and author of a forthcoming book with Penguin, which is due out later this year, called What Millennials Want, an intimate profile of young India. Some of his writings have been published in the Washington Post, the Times of India, Mint, and the Print. That has a nice sound to it, Mint and the Print. While Mahesh is one of the most knowledgeable people I know on the state of India's higher education, at least some of Radhika's recent research and writing is on the subject of India's labor market. Vivan, on the other hand, in the last 2 or 3 years, preparing for his book, traveled more than 30,000 kilometers across 13 Indian states to interview more than 900 millennials, educators, business people, and policymakers to investigate the economic aspirations, social views, and political attitudes of young Indians. The title of today's discussion suggests that we'll be looking at the challenges and opportunities that are there for India's young people in the coming decade. To a great extent, this is a speculative exercise, but the idea is to look closely at India as it is today. India's young people, the labor market, employment opportunities, the aspirations of young people, and try to make relatively informed projections about the future, particularly the coming years, the next few years. So while the challenges posed by COVID-19 form the immediate backdrop, we are not going to be necessarily focused on COVID-19 as such. Let me begin with a broad general question for each one of our panelists, and I request you to limit your answers to no more than 5 minutes. And this is something which you can each answer from your different vantage points. When you think of the decade ahead and the place of India's young people in terms of what they can achieve, what are the barriers that they face, and what are the aspirations they have, do you feel confident or concerned? I mean, the answer probably is a mix of the two. There are things to be optimistic about. There are things that are of concern. But what are those things that make you feel upbeat, and what are those things that are downright worrying? And I thought, we would begin this. I would begin by asking Vivan, actually, because he's the one who's actually traveled, I'm sure, more than any of us, including the two other panelists. So Vivan, what do you think? I mean, what do you feel upbeat about, and what are you concerned about when you think of India's young people today?
Well, first, thanks for having me on this discussion. And I think some of these conversations are vitally important, given we have a median age of 28 and the world's largest population of young people. But there just aren't enough conversations around these young people that are taking place right now. And how do we actually fully realize the potential of our so-called demographic dividend? Or is it already too late, and are we moving towards a demographic disaster? Now, that's, of course, a bigger question that's going to take a few years, if not decades, to fully answer. But to answer your question about what I'm upbeat about and what I'm concerned of, I'll first speak about what I'm concerned about. Well, before COVID-19, we already knew that data told us that, unemployment has been at a 45-year high. You saw news reports of 19 million people applying for 63,000 railway jobs, and lots of stories like that. And just any trip that all most of my work has been in small town India, and any trip to any of these towns, you go to a Jabalpur, you go to a Calicut, you just see hordes of young people, mostly young men, and they're just totally unemployed. And you go and talk to them, and some of them might have jobs on the farm, but most are sort of doing, odd jobs here and there for a local patron or a heavyweight. And that's a real problem, right? Like without formal employment, without a formal source of income and savings and money in the bank, it's very difficult for young people to really build a stable life for themselves. How do you buy a home, or how do you pay rent? How do you become financially independent? Young people in India still get married at the age of 21, 22, and their parents by 23 and 24. These are, of course, people largely outside of Delhi and Mumbai and Bangalore. And how do those people provide for their families? How are they building a foundation for the rest of their lives if the employment situation is so bleak? Now that was already before COVID-19. Now with the pandemic, it has to be acknowledged that young Indians have once again borne the brunt of the economic devastation that we've seen. We were sort of asked to stay at home to protect our healthcare systems and to keep others from getting sick, with the result that jobs in industries have just been wiped out, and we don't know when they're coming back. Now some have begun to come back, but we needed to create jobs before the pandemic, and so now we really need to turbocharge that job creation now. The biggest thing I'm worried about, and I already spoke about this from my research, is economic insecurity, because that affects every aspect of the life of Indian youth. If you do not have financial stability, if you do not have a stable income, it's very difficult for you to really go out and make something of yourself, or even change the world, if you're not able to put food on the table for yourself. Now, when you're economically insecure, you're dependent on your family, and you're much more dependent on the decisions that others make for you. You lack that critical agency in your life to not just make your own decisions, but to set your own destiny. Now, that's a really critical element that we're not talking enough about. That young Indians are very constrained by society, but also by their personal economies in their daily lives. And this is a challenge. How do you create a happy country? How do you create an Atmanirbhar country if you're not able to actually make something of yourself? So that's a little bit about what I'm worried about. What I'm optimistic of is that India is a resilient country. Jugaad and things like that really do, hold unique place in our lives than they do in other places of the world. And I haven't spent the entire pandemic in India. I was in the US for a little bit, but in the little bit of work that I've done since coming back and my interactions, I've got a sense that the economic devastation, that the data we have, while that is obviously true that there've been a lot of it, young people are also very resilient, and they've been able to sort of, continue living their lives through this, and it hasn't gotten as bad as I initially thought it would. Of course, it's gotten really bad. We've seen managers give up jobs in from Manrega, 100 days of paid labor, and that's absolutely horrible. But there's a lot of resilience out there that young people and industriousness that young people possess, and again set Indians apart from a lot of other people I've seen elsewhere. But we obviously must not take advantage of that. Just because people over here are resilient doesn't mean that we don't create policy solutions and we don't create economic solutions to actually move this country forward. Another thing I'm optimistic about is that young people today are, or what I've seen, I can't compare to previous generations, are more eager, or they're more willing to take risks. And so that can also be harnessed in an entrepreneurial sense in making more people job creators. Of course, it has to be accompanied with a lot of other things, with financial stability being the topmost one. But that is one thing about my generation that I have noticed is that people are more willing to really, if they need to go off the beaten path a little bit. I don't want to ramble on too much, and so that's my 2 cents on the subject.
Thank you, Vivan. Radhika, would you like to add something to what Vivan just said?
So thank you, Pushkar, for having me part of this discussion. Your title was really apt when you said the decade ahead for the youth, because we are starting this decade on a truly exceptional note in the backdrop of some very serious challenges. If you think of the children of liberalization, the youth which was born in the post-91 period, this is the first time in their life that they are witnessing negative economic growth. I mean, this is the aspirational generation which has got accustomed to seeing growth rates of 7 to 8%. And here we are with a -7%. So I'm sure this is a cause of tremendous anxiety and concern for the youth. And all this is compounded by the fact that Vivan was mentioning, that India is going through this demographic window of opportunity right now, where the share of working age population is rising very rapidly, where the growth of the working age population essentially exceeds the growth rate of the total population. And when you have a large number of people in your workforce, what that means is they have higher incomes, they have higher savings, there's more capital per unit labor, and there's more economic growth. But our ability to essentially realize this demographic dividend is contingent on our ability to create productive and well-paying jobs for the youth of India. And it's really a sorry situation in that sense at this point. Even though we're somewhere midway through this period of the demographic dividend, we've actually done a fairly poor job of creating those well-paid jobs for young Indians. Vivan alluded to some of those statistics. I mean, just to reinforce, and I'm going to tell you something more about before the pandemic, because the pandemic has just accentuated those problems. In 2018-19, the youth unemployment rate was already 17%. If you look at the educated youth, those who have secondary education and above, the numbers were about 25%. Now, of course, the high unemployment rate amongst educated youth is not a new phenomenon in India. It's been there since the 70s. And of course, it's indicative of the fact that the kind of economic growth we are witnessing is not creating employment opportunities that these youth think are commensurate with their educational qualifications. But this high unemployment rate amongst the educated youth also raises a question mark about the quality of education that they're being imparted, because you always hear employers talking about the lack of employability, despite the fact you have this high unemployment rate amongst the educated youth. The other very worrying point is that, one is the high unemployment rate amongst the youth. The other is that even the quality of employment that we have generated for the youth is in fact quite poor. Now, Vivan was talking about how the youth are constrained by their family, their economic agency is limited. About 22% of the youth in India actually work as unpaid family workers, which means, they're working off farm, on farm, but in some family enterprise. So they don't draw a salary of their own, but essentially they're drawing from the pool of resources that their family earns. And you have just about 30% of the youth actually working in what the data calls regular salary jobs. So, that's some form of secure employment. And even there, much of this youth is engaged in informal work arrangements. Just about 9% of them are actually working in regular formal jobs, which means that they have access to even one basic social security net. And this is also worrying, not just because of what it does to their security, their income and economic security at this point, but what's also going to happen when this large cohort actually retires. You're going to have this vast pool of retired aged people who actually have access to no social security. And that's going to be a huge disaster for India at that point as well. So clearly we've been doing quite miserably before the pandemic. And what the post-pandemic data, if you look at some of the numbers that come out from the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, CMIE, more popularly known as that, what you find there that again, it's really the youth which have borne a disproportionate impact of the job losses that we've witnessed. About 60%, the survey found that about 60% of those who were in the 15 to 24 age category lost their jobs. And what's more, when they lost their jobs, these people were far less likely to even find employment later as compared to older workers. That was either because they had less experience or because they had, they were less networked in the labor market. So there's been a huge amount of joblessness amongst the youth in the post-pandemic situation. New job opportunities are very limited because there are limited vacancies. There's no new hiring which is happening. The kind of work they are getting now is in fact even more precarious than it was before, because you're seeing the labor market become more and more informal as firms are reluctant to hire people with, with jobs with fixed contracts or social security and so on and so forth. So there's this huge risk to my mind that for a lot of these young people who are entering the workforce for the first time, they're likely to face what is called a scarring effect on their career. And what this scarring effect does, apart from being highly demotivating and discouraging, is that it also increases the probability of you being unemployed later in your career and also imposes some sort of wage penalty. So I would say overall, the situation is a very grim one for the youth from my perspective at this point, because they're really facing multiple challenges. I mean, one, they are facing huge disruptions in their education and training. They're amplified vulnerabilities because of the nature of work that they're doing or the sector in which they're employed. And also, their journey to moving towards decent work has now become a much more arduous one. And all of this put together really risks hurting the productive potential of an entire generation and creating what some people are calling the lockdown generation. And that's a disaster we seriously have to try and avert.
Mahesh, what's your take on this?
I'll actually, split this into 2 or 3 questions, Pushkar. I think, every prime minister, right from Nehru downwards, have been talking of demographic dividend that India is to earn. My question always comes back to, are we even preparing for what's about to come in terms of the opportunities that we need to create for these youth to be actually gainfully employed, for us to reap that dividend? It simply can't happen in vacuum that we think that we are more populated and we think that we are younger nation, and so we have a right to the dividend, right? And from there you come down to the basic question that any government should be asking itself, which is that okay, you are 65% of the productive age group is in the 15 to 64 age group, 65, 68, whatever number you talk of. The question is, what are you doing to make them employable? That's the first question. And the second question is, assuming they're employable, what are you doing to create so many jobs so that they actually become productively employable? And that's where I think we as a nation, I won't even say we are underprepared. We are not even preparing is my thing. Everything is happening by chance. Everything is happening not to a plan, but largely to the entrepreneurial spirit of a nation, like what we once said, the Jugaad generation or whatever you call it, right? But it's essentially happening despite the government and not because of the government. It is happening despite the planning and not because of a planning, because we don't even know what is the sector that's going to really drive employment for this youth that we talk of. Like, it's easier to say, for example, that we are a Jugaad generation, so we will find an employment. But that's also to do with, in economics, what you call underemployment, right? When you actually have an MBA working under the NREGA scheme, it's underemployment for you. And that is another problem that we as a nation have to be dealing with, right? So for me, it is in manifold a larger question of whether we as a country are preparing ourselves for the number of youth that are about to come into the employment thing, right? The lockdown generation, what Radhika talked of, you actually are dealing with 2023 becoming, we'll be back to what we were in 2020, which means 3 years are lost in terms of the economic development. And in these 3 years, Pushkar, you actually have about close to about 40 to 50 million youth coming into the job market. Now, how do you deal with that? On one hand, we are unable to create as many jobs as every year what we are supposed to create. And then add to that the 40 to 50 million, people who would either have lost the job or wouldn't have had an opportunity to get onto a job, any which ways, right? It can be the youth or it can be someone else. It can be slightly senior, but the numbers are still the same, right? That, you're dealing with about 50 million extra jobs that should be created or should have been created. Now, you will actually have an EPFO data which says that, listen, we've been creating so many jobs and so on and so forth. But that is EPFO data. It is underemployment also, right? Because you lost jobs somewhere else and you plugged it in with through a governmental scheme or someone working in a farm or someone working at home. And that is not the solution for what we as a country are supposed to be preparing for. If we are prepared as a country, we'll actually be saying that this is the kind of manpower that we need over the next 2-3 decades. These are kind of skills that we would require over the next 2-3 decades, and that is what we would create. But that doesn't seem to be happening, because you look at the skill gap also, it is quite appalling in the sense that thankfully the NEP has come and it is saying that we're going to empower the skill sector or through formal education itself, so that people who gain some skills would also be added as credits in formal education or formal degree programs, right? But recently there was a survey that was conducted by Udemy, and it basically said, and it's a global skills gap survey, and for India, 92% of employees in India believe that there is a skill gap for themselves, and 83% of those employees felt that they have been impacted because they did not have the required skill. Now, who's supposed to create the skill is a very moot question at this point in time. It can be the government, it can be individual, or whatever it is. Now, in a certain sense, the entrepreneurial spirit of the nation is ensuring that certain of these skills have been created, but the planning or the strategy or the direction that is supposed to be coming from a planning body or the government, I think is missing in the space. Now, if you look at the ILO survey also that was recently created, it's very clearly said that India will have about 30 to 40 million skill gap jobs that are going to go away by 2030, which means you actually have a skill shortage very clearly. So for me, the question is, are we creating enough jobs? My answer is no. Are we creating education system that will ensure that those skill gaps are created so that they become employable? No. Assuming we are not even creating that, what happens to the individuals? We are dealing with underemployment. So for me, and this is on one side. On the other side, the bigger problem that I have is that while the returns out of formal education are coming down so dramatically because you're no longer finding jobs, on the other hand, you have the cost of education rising alarmingly. You wouldn't believe this. We as a nation, when we talk of demographic dividend, the cost of IIT education just about 12 years back, Pushkar, was 25,000 rupees, and IIM was 2.2 lakh rupees. Today it's 26 lakh rupees. If we believe that India needs to, reap its demographic dividend, then you simply can't have education going 12 times, 13 times over the last 12 years, right? I'm not saying for one moment that, you need to be not market-led, but institutions which have been created from public money must ensure that they intervene in the market by ensuring better quality education at the most optimal price. I'm not for once again saying that, listen, IIM should be offering it at, if someone can pay, after getting into IIM, if he gets 20 lakh job, why can't IIM just, charge 26 lakhs? That's again a very petty question in my perspective. That's because an IIM, an IIT, any governmental institution must create such good quality education at such optimal price that the private sector, which education is being open to, right, has to compete with them for that optimal pricing as well as quality, right? And that is not happening. So because of which you actually have IIM start charging 26 lakhs, even the private sector starts charging 20 lakhs or 15 lakhs. Now, in which case, when you charge a 15 lakh in a tier 2 B school in the country, the ROI is not there. And if the placement is not there, you actually have another problem, which is an NPS problem. So what we're dealing with is that, we actually have, if you talk of numbers, big numbers. We have about 40 million students right now in the studying undergrad and above. We have another 27 million students who are studying in class 11th and 12th. You add 9th and 10th, it's 100 million students. Now, when I say 9, the reason why I said 9th is, by the definition of demographic dividend, you're dealing with age 15 to be in class 9th at this point in time, right? So when you have 100 million people in the education system who are studying with a promise that they will be delivered a job or they will get a job at some point in time, and you don't deliver that on that promise while increasing the cost of that formal education, then we are looking at a possible nightmare. Because the same people having spent a lot of money not getting a job, you know what exactly happens in these kind of situations. The banks will go bust, the students will be sitting at home, or they'll be underemployed. Maybe I'm painting a very sorry picture, but I think it's important for us as a nation to start planning for the youth of this country in terms of how you'll create as many jobs as they are as the youth are coming out. And if you're not able to create those kind of jobs which offer you so much money, then you create within formal education sets of education pieces which ensure that there is not, the cost of education is lesser, and you get an outcome which is good for the kind of education that you had. See, India is a country where you have chola bhatura being sold at 5 rupees and 5,000 rupees, and you have takers at both level. The similar level, you actually have students going to IIM, and you actually have tier 3 students going into the worst colleges and still finding an employment for themselves. People are not sitting at home. You're not dealing with a country which has only Salman Khan fans, mind you. They're also working in some certain sense, but right. But having said that, there is a gross underemployment that we're looking at. The government can come back with an EPFO number which says that, listen, so many EPFO accounts are opened to create a proxy for employment, but that's not the real thing. There is, for sure, there is unemployment, and assuming unemployment is not there or is not to the extent that we all believe it isn't based on EPFO numbers, then there's very gross underemployment, and both are a serious problem for the nation. You're mute.
Yeah. Thank you, Mahesh. Thank you, Radhika and Vivan, for your answers, for your observations. The second question was about the labor market, but Radhika sort of talked a little bit about that, and Mahesh too already. But so I'll get to something more specific in regarding this question. Radhika, what do you see, which sector do you see as driving India's economic growth in the coming years? Because when if we can identify the sector or sectors which can drive growth, again, there has to be a match between, what the skill set, what the knowledge set of the young population is, whether they'll fit in to those sectors. We talked about the skills gap and so on and so forth. Now, so the first question is, what sectors do you see as important in the coming decade, and whether young people, based on the current set of skills, education, or even the debt burden, and this is something we'll take up a little later. Student debt is going to become a larger problem in the coming years. And how big is the mismatch? And again, Mahesh, I think you'll also be able to say something about this. Vivan, again, based on your field research, maybe you heard things about people not getting jobs even though they have degrees. It could be because of the lack of opportunities. It could be because there's a mismatch between what employers are looking for and what young people have in terms of their skills. And we already, Mahesh mentioned underemployment. Underemployment, most people agree. I mean, I think it's commonly agreed now that underemployment has emerged as the single largest challenge. It's not so much unemployment, but it is underemployment, punctuated by phases of complete unemployment. So how much of the underemployment do you see as being central to this crisis? And where are women placed in all of this? Because there has been a shrinking of female participation in the workforce for a variety of reasons. A recent newspaper study basically said that, I think it was by I don't recall, somebody from IIT Delhi, and it was because parents want to be completely involved in making sure that the child gets the best education possible, and that often means that the mother stays at home. So whatever be the reasons, but you cannot drive economic growth on the basis of, on the shoulders of men alone, right? I mean, if you want to escape that middle income trap, even though it's a lower middle income trap that we are looking at, there have to be more women participating in the labor market, in the be part of the workforce. So Radhika, we'll begin with you, and then Mahesh, and then Vivan.
So, Pushkar, the question about underemployment, if you actually go back looking at employment data that exists in India, right from the time of independence, what you find is that essentially the problem has been one of underemployment. And that's been the underlying theme, because essentially we're such a poor country. We don't have social security, we don't have unemployment allowance. So the cost of remaining unemployed is basically very high, and people will do whatever work that comes their way, and they are largely underemployed. Unemployment, on the other hand, many have argued, is essentially a luxury which is enjoyed by a few who are better off, in particular the educated and the well-off, because they feel that unless they get a job which is commensurate with their educational qualifications, they're not going to do it. Which is why the high open unemployment rate that you see is basically amongst the educated youth. And you don't find such high open unemployment rates in any other cohort in the population. And it's only because of this changing demographic profile and the fact that education levels have improved over time that we're now seeing a higher open unemployment rate in India. The controversy that happened 2 years ago about India having the highest unemployment rate in 45 years, the jump in that statistic from 2 to 3% to now 6% at an aggregate level was essentially a function of all these demographic changes and the change in the education profile of the population. So unfortunately, now we don't have just an underemployment problem, but we also have a problem of open unemployment, which we didn't have until recently. But again, both are a terrible situation to be in. So I want to pick up on a couple of points, starting with skills that you raised. I think the skills issue is absolutely critical. When you ask me which are the sectors the jobs are going to be created, I think that that's a question that is very hard to answer at this point, because we know that there are very rapid changes happening in the world of work. There was all this talk about a fourth industrial revolution even before the pandemic happened. And we know now that a lot of those changes, the pace of those changes has accelerated in the post-pandemic world. So it's very hard to sort of pin down and say that these are the specific skills. You need X number of electricians, or you need Y number of plumbers to meet the skill deficit. And I think the trouble is that we've been thinking of skills in these narrow silos, whereas changes happening in the world of work are so rapid that by the time we actually skill these people, it may well be the case that what they're trained in becomes completely redundant. And this is a conversation that's been happening now for 2-3 years. A lot of multilateral organizations have been involved in this, and there was a very nice report that the World Bank and the ILO came out with. And they said, what you need to invest in vis-a-vis skills. There were 3 broad areas. One, they said, were cognitive skills, which are basically your analytical skills, thinking skills, problem-solving skills, social behavioral skills, which are things which machines are less likely to replace, at least for now. And more importantly, the skill of adaptability, which means that you've got to have these foundational skills that allow you to adjust and adapt yourself to whatever sector the jobs are created, or whatever types of enterprises are creating those jobs. But these are things which you have to establish, at the foundational level. Now, we've been talking about the state of higher education in India, and most of the conversation on the education side revolves around higher education. But I think it's when we talk of these kind of 3 foundational skills, we need to step back and see what's happening at the primary education level. Because we know enrollment rates have gone up, they've been right to education, so access to education has improved. But what have been the learning outcomes of that? Every year after year, we know from the ASER surveys that class 5 children can't do the arithmetic or the reading that a class 2 child can do. People don't have basic, children at 14 or 16 years of age also don't have basic cognitive skills. Like if you tell them you have to sell this item with a 10% discount on it, how much will you sell the item for? So the failing of our education, and more broadly, even if we invest in skills, unless we have done this at the foundational level and we ensure that we resolve this learning crisis at the primary school level, it's going to be very difficult to actually create a cohort which is employable. Because, all the employers complain that this workforce is not job ready, it's not work ready, we have to invest in training them. Now, there's no education or skilling system or any program that is designed by NSDC or a sector skill council, which can actually do that very accurately. But you have to give them the broad tools, at least, that allow them to adjust to whatever changes are happening in the world of work. And on the women issue, I think this is a big sore point for us, because labor force participation rate for women has now dropped to 24%. And all this talk of demographic dividend means nothing if half your population is not even in the labor force. So, not being in the labor force means these women are not even going out and searching for employment. And this is a result of a confluence of factors. Frankly, I don't think there's a silver bullet to solving this problem, because a part of the reason that you've seen the decline in the labor force participation rate of women is that as family incomes have increased, a lot of women who were working in, say, their farms because of poverty, because of distress, they have actually withdrawn out of the labor force. Women in India are not able to even find the kind of jobs which are more friendly to women. Say, look at the case of Bangladesh, where there's textile, there's apparel, and that creates a lot of jobs which are conducive for women. So the lack of good jobs for women is another reason that disincentivizes them from joining the workforce. And of course, we have, so many social cultural factors that have inhibited women from participating in the labor force. And all of that put together, I think, really impedes our ability to realize this demographic dividend. And before I finish, I just want to go back to something that both Vivan and Mahesh spoke about in terms of, the entrepreneurial and the jugaad spirit of Indians. I feel like sometimes we over-glorify the entrepreneurial spirit of Indians, because they're not these dynamic, risk-taking, Steve Jobs kind of entrepreneurs that we're thinking of. A lot of these people are basically trying to do something small because they can't find a good job, because they can't find a regular salaried jobs. And so the underemployment that we've been talking about is reflective in a large number of these people actually being self-employed. In the data, you find that only 2% of the workforce falls in the category of employers who we could think of as entrepreneurs who are creating jobs for others. The rest are really running what we call own account enterprises, that is household enterprises, or their family and with their family workers working with them. So I think, we have to be cautious about that and not over glorify it.
Mahesh? Sorry. Yeah, Mahesh, it's your turn.
So I agree on the entrepreneurial spirit. By the way, I always think that the word entrepreneur, even Dhirubhai Ambani was an entrepreneur, but he was called a Lala, right? So the thing about entrepreneur is, I think we've created these two buzzwords called startups and entrepreneurs, and have started putting everything that's been created into that bucket. Having said that, for me, when I say entrepreneurial spirit, I'm saying that there are people who are willing to create their own small enterprise and employ 200, 300 people, and then still ensure that the wheels of the economy keep running. Steve Jobs comes once in a way, so it's fine. But I'm just saying that when you have 1 million people creating 200-300 jobs, it's fantastic. Like when I go to colleges and all, I tell them that, listen, you don't need to keep looking at Facebook creator and Apple creator. You just look at one of your own employees who's created a auto mechanic shop and has expanded to 5 mechanical shops and employs about 50 people. That's good enough for you to say that that's how you go about it. Because some of these the big idols that you have, it can be Narayan Murthy, which is what India has, are too much out of reach that the student can't imagine himself or herself to be that person. And when you can't touch and feel the person, it becomes a challenge for a student to say, I want to be him or her. It is good to be an aspiration, but not otherwise. Coming back to the sectors that you talked of, Pushkar, you actually have to see where India is in terms of our import bills, where India is in its trade, world trade, and so on and so forth. India occupies 2% of the world trade. China occupies 26%. If you look at the kind of imports that India has, India imports about India's import bill is about $480 billion last year, right? Of which $120 billion is in manufacturing. You import mobile phones for $20 billion. You import electrical machinery worth $50 billion. Machinery including computers is $44 billion. Optical, technical, and medical apparatus is $10 billion. Even India imports agarbatti. I was telling one of my friends who's very fond of the current dispensation. I said, listen, you have China and you have agarbattis, and the gods that you actually pray to are coming from China. The agarbattis are coming from China. So you should be very careful about what the feed that you step onto when you deal with these kind of things, right? So, and in fact, this is a question that I raised with Mr. Narayan Murthy long back. I said, has the software it is wrong to blame one sector for the other sector's growth or one sector for the other sector's fall, but when the services sector took off, the infotech sector, let me narrow it down to the information technology sector, it came at a price to India as far as manufacturing sector is concerned. You don't have an engineer who wants to join L&T or a small manufacturing company. They join a biotech engineer and a mechanical engineer, ultimately join a Cognizant or an Accenture and still keep doing the coding job, which means there is now, I don't even know whether in economics we call them underemployment, because they've been trained for something but they're doing something else, right? So for me, the first thing that India must crack is the systems and processes and the red tape that has somehow inhibited a manufacturing enterprises to flourish. You take it right from Tirupur, where our garment industry is struggling, where Bangladesh has taken such a huge lead. As Radhika said rightly, that the underemployment starts with or unemployment starts with our women not being employed, right? And on the other side, we are killing our own textile industry because of the kind of taxes that you impose on them, where you outprice them from the world market. You create a disadvantage for them so that they can't compete in the world market, and so on and so forth, right? So the first thing that you need to do is to deal with the manufacturing sector and how we can create a system where manufacturing flourishes. And if you see around you, Pushkar, you'll realize that no startup, we talk of startups and startups, how many of them actually want to get into manufacturing as a startup? Right? It creates a problem somewhere in the line, right from the IITs to the IIMs to most of us. We are saying that, listen, I'd be a startup when I don't have a machine creating something. I'm a startup only when I create something of my own IP or something like that, right? So that is a challenge that we need to deal with. And for that to be dealt with, you need to, clear the cogwheels of corruption and red tape and the license raj and the inspector raj that you have, because that's what has somehow taken away the sheen out of India's possible, march towards manufacturing. We could have continued to grow in manufacturing while working on services, but it shouldn't have been that the manufacturing stalls or is stunted, and then services takes over, right? So that's the first thing that you need to deal with. And two, obviously the services sector, right? What exactly is happening in the services sector at this point in time? A lot of countries are also now competing with us. So the initial advantage that we had of a lower cost of services is slowly getting out of us. And both these things for me are a priority: the manufacturing to begin with, and then the services sector. And also going along with that, I think we also need to create an education system which recognizes the skills as education and not necessarily the qualification as education, right? We are a country which killed IITs, rather ITIs, and created BTechs on top of them, and we are unable to employ the BTechs, right? The engineers, right? Aspirationally, it is fine for a student to say, I want to be an engineer and not an ITI trained professional. But an ITI trained professional was far more employable than a BTech guy. At this point in time, also, I think it's the same thing all through. And same with polytechnics. Where is the polytechnic education going? Where is the ITI education going? So the way, there has to be a pyramid structure that we as a country have to work on, which is that, you have the ITS and the polytechnics and the BTech engineers, and on top of that, technocrats, and so on and so forth. You're moving forward. But what we did was, every time when we created something on top, we removed the bottom out of it, right? There is some study which says that not more than 10% of the polytechnics are employable. Now, I remember when I was a kid, Pushkar, that I applied to a JNTU Polytechnic and did not get a seat. It is competitive. Today, you walk in and you get it because it's not the least aspirational. And so on an education system, you need to ensure that there's the bottom of the pyramid skill sets are acknowledged, respected, and regarded. And on the other side, once you create that supply side of it, you ensure that on the other side, you actually have created a manufacturing system which will compete with the global economy, so that it's not just about the $120 billion of manufacturing imports that we can replace, but even if we grow from 2% of the global world trade, and China is 26%, by the way, to about 6%, we're talking about 3x the growth of what we have currently, right? And I'm not saying it's easy, but it is achievable if we as a nation declog the gutter that we filled into the space to which made manufacturing get stifled and is on its deathbed in a sense.
Thanks, Mahesh. Vivan, I would just like to add a small bit to the larger question on underemployment and your experiences in when you met all these people. I don't know, about 900 people. One, you probably saw this, right? I mean, when you met with people, traveled around the country, underemployment being a bigger problem somewhat than unemployment. And how many of them, I'm just curious, how many of your respondents were women out of these 900 odd approximately? Because that would also allow us, I mean, here you have economists and others who are dealing with these large numbers, and here you are actually going to the ground and talking to people. So could you give us a sense of how much of underemployment is a larger problem perhaps, and especially for women?
No, I'll definitely address women underemployment. And then I also want to talk a little bit about the education and skilling bits that we were discussed earlier, because I did some interesting field work on those as well. To answer your women question first, I think if when you do field research in India, you'll understand how difficult it is to talk to women in small town India. And this is including if I was a woman researcher, it would be very difficult, because in at least the demographic I was trying to talk to, because of societal rules, it's a little difficult for a single man to approach a woman or a group of women. So I would say that the sampling, I mean, not I would say, I have a number, it's about 350 out of 900, which is over a third, but it's definitely not half. And I address this in the book, and I say that I've spoken to many other field researchers as well who also find it very difficult to talk to women in small town India. Now, to talk about underemployment and skilling, one of the first trips I did when I began my field work, I spent about a week at the Infosys campus in Mysore, which is the world's largest corporate training center. And I spoke to everyone over there. I spoke to their executives. I spoke to their new hires. And I think everyone knows that they train 10,000 new hires at a time for 6 months. And they invest almost, I think, between 5 to 10 lakhs on each new hire, which is a lot of money for 6 months. And I asked them, well, when you're hiring people, what are you looking for? And they told me, actually, they volunteered this. They told me, we're not looking for skills, we're looking for aptitude. Because they know that skills are not available, but the ability to teach those skills, which is aptitude, is what they're looking for. And Infosys, they take engineers, people who are meant to have learned these skills in college, and they're like, well, you haven't learned these things, so we're going to teach them to you in 6 months so that you can become employable and join the company. Now, obviously, Infosys has the money to do this, and a few of its competitors do this as well. And as a side note, what this also means is it's much harder for startups to actually hire talent, because they either have to pay much more, they have to, they have to hire 10 people to do the job of 4. But that's a side note. About education and skilling, I think we have a problem in this country of too much education, at least on paper, that people have gotten too many degrees. And the problem is that many of these degrees are not actually quality degrees. Now, a lot of my research has been done in Indore, which is, and we all know it's in Madhya Pradesh, but it's actually become an education hub that almost rivals that of Kota. And there's places in Indore, there's these buildings you go. There's this place in Indore called Bhagal Kua, and there's a building over there which has 300 colleges and coaching institutes in one building. Some of those colleges are one room, some are two rooms, some are 5 rooms, and they're giving people degrees. And you go and talk to the people there, and they're getting BTechs, and they're getting BComs, and they're getting all of these degrees. And some of the courses are taught by people who actually flunked those degrees and then got them on the second or third attempt. So, I don't really need to tell you about the quality of these degrees, and, but to say that the quality leaves a lot to be desired. So if you are trying to attract the jobs that Bangladesh is creating or that Vietnam is creating, we need to ask ourselves, do people need a university degree for those jobs? Do people need a university degree to work at Tirupur or to work at Morbi? They don't. Why? So why are we putting these people into those pipelines? Why are we stressing their families? Why are we putting that, thing on welfare incomes that these people need to go to college and then get one of those jobs? And that's if we want to be creating those jobs. So we need to even ask ourselves that question: do we want the jobs that Bangladesh is creating? Have people gone to those factories, those garment factories in Bangladesh, and actually seen the working conditions over there? Bangladesh only attracts them because it has extremely loose labor laws. And I'm actually in favor of deregulation, but not to the point where there's fires and 100 people die, because that's the type of manufacturing that Bangladesh is attracting. Now, I can't speak to Vietnam, which I think is a bit of a higher value manufacturing, but we need to think what type of jobs do we want, and then of course we need to create the conditions for those. But I don't think a lot of young people today look at the type of jobs that Bangladesh is creating and being like, okay, I want that, because it's not the best job out there. So we also need to aim a little bit higher, which I don't think is that difficult to do. I myself have spent some time in South Korea. I was doing research over there, and when I was an undergraduate, and I saw what that country has been able to pull off. In 1950, it was poorer than Zambia, and of course poorer than India, and today it's a member of the OECD, and they have no natural resources and tiny, and they have a neighbor that hates them as well, and they had to spend a lot of money on keeping that neighbor away. So again, these things are not impossible. They can be done, but we also need to prioritize accordingly. We can't do Bangladesh at the same time, and Vietnam and South Korea and America, and expect to achieve all of those. Now, about skilling, I do think skilling institutes are sort of the way to go. Whether this is coaching for English, whether this is coaching for specific skills that fix existing gaps, that people can do a 6-month course, become very skilled at a certain trade or profession, and then go and plug that demand that might exist. I don't think people need to be in colleges to do that, and I think it's a huge problem that we're putting people through the college system to do it. We have too many people who are getting higher education, at least in my opinion right now, and that's not required at all. And then I also wanted to, the actual underemployment problem. Again, you just go to any of these towns and you talk to young people over there, and most don't have formal jobs. And they are just sort of, engaged in some sort of trade, and it's never commerce, it's always trade. You don't see young people in India in business suits the way you would in other countries. You don't see them engaged in, those sorts of, commercial sort of interactions with colleagues that you do in other countries. And I think that's a real pity, that we have this generation that's very aspirational. They all want desk jobs. They all want to sit behind computers and create value, like what they're able to see on their smartphones, right? Like you have these incredible aspirations, but people are not actually able to fulfill them. And of course, that's the education problem. And there's also the problem that many of those jobs don't even exist. So yeah, those are, that's a little bit of what I'd seen. There was one more point I wanted to make, which I forgot while I was making my other points, but if it comes back to me, I'll sort of chime in with it.
Vivan, we will come back to you. So towards the end, but uh, I want you to consider a question which I'm just going to ask, which I think is outside your domain of expertise or perhaps even interest, but something perhaps worth speculating about a little bit. Uh, about 2 years ago, I wrote a couple of longish essays on the social consequences of the lack of opportunities for young people, or their inability to utilize those opportunities, the skills gap. Uh, and I speculated, this is the couple of co-authored longish essays, as where I reasoned that this is likely to have tragic social consequences in the coming years, perhaps certainly in the form of growing social unrest. And in India, we have always seen some of that, whether it is, protest activity of any kind, farmers protests, student protests, teachers protests, we are a protest society. I mean, have been for a while. Uh, but on the other hand, there are those who argue that in India, we are accustomed to waiting, and waiting very, very patiently for something good to happen. For and Craig Jeffrey, and a geographer, a human geographer, has a book actually on the subject, Time Pass. So waiting, time pass, basically is our protection, I think. I mean, that is the other view. That could be the other view, against growing social unrest. Now, as I said, this is not something which belongs to your area of expertise, but surely as thinking people, I wondered if you would want to put your mind to it. Uh, uh, should we begin with Mahesh again? Okay.
Oh gosh, protest and me. No, I think, see, a protest happens when a promise is broken, or the feeling that the promise has been broken. It can be a perception or reality, that's a different matter. But a protest happens when there is a bit of unfairness, there is a bit of injustice, or there's a feeling of unfairness, injustice, promises broken, and so on and so forth. I can guarantee you that you take the students through the garden path of saying that you finish this education and I'll give you a job, and they don't get a job and they have a lone bank guy knocking on their doors. All these guys would be protesting on the streets. It happened in Kerala, by the way. In Kerala, the bankers went after the parents' mortgage property for recovery of dues or student loans. And the entire student community came on the streets. That's because they said, listen, here we are. We studied in an education system that you, drafted out. You look at the student's plight at this point in time, Pushkar. He studies what we tell them to study. He takes an exam in what we ask them to take an examination on. We pass them. We certify them. We set the pass score. We give them a degree. We tell them that you're an engineer now. And then at the end of it, we say you're unemployable. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous, right? And this kind of dumping down of our thought process onto our children has been on for ages now. It's not something new. It's not something that happened over the last 5-7 years. Now, if you go and tell the student at some point in time, millions of students, that you've taken bank loans, now you better bloody well pay back, you'll have protests on the streets because there's unfairness in the promise. And remember this, Pushkar, while we talk of skill gaps and all, look at it from the other side. When I was passing out, I was told that you pass class 12, you'll get a good job. And a few years later, you were told that if you have a graduation, you'll get a good job. Now you're telling them that you need to have a post-graduation. On top of that, you need to have 3-4 skills to become an employable person. The fact is that we are having lesser jobs for more people coming into the system. So one, we are postponing the promise that we made to the children that if you pass this examination, you'll get a job. And two, we're unable to create enough jobs. So you keep adding one more certification and 2 more certifications, 3 more certifications as we move along. Now, that might be the way the world is moving for all that I know. But from the student perspective, it is slightly unfair. So the social unrest is here to stay. Now, you call them Andolan JV or you call them protest country. But in a country of the size of India, you can't have one single rule that you can impose on the people, right? The quid pro quo is that you become a China and become the most developed country or whatever it is. Now, I don't think India, the way we are structured, I'm not saying that we should be that or we should not be that. That's not my opinion. I'm not sitting in judgment here, but it's extremely difficult for India to move as fast in a dictatorial environment as China would be. And so to that extent, it will always be a conversation, a debate, a discussion, and then a decision. And by then you will actually have another 10 years of demographic dividend being whittled away. So, but having said that, I think you call it social unrest or you call it a victim's fight for fairness. It depends on which side of the table you are. You earlier talked of teachers, protests. Now, where are you on teachers' protests? Which side of the table are you on teachers' protests? And that's what will keep coming back and haunting us, haunting us as a nation. But they have a right to protest, and that's where I stand.
Radhika?
So, I think we as a generation are definitely waiting for good things to happen. And there's one very nice statistic that captures that. It's called the NEET rate, the youth which is not in education, employment, or training. So basically people who are doing nothing but waiting, and that's 35% of our youth. That's roughly 130 million people are just waiting and indulging in the great Indian time pass and waiting for a good job to come their way. And I think that, at some point, this particular generation will run out of patience. Because like I said, the post-liberalization, those born in the post-liberalization era are used to, in their childhood, they've seen growths of 7 to 8%. Their impression of the kind of India they would be in by the time they enter their workforce is very different from the kind of situation we are in right now. The entire period, despite this rapid economic growth, was called a period of jobless growth starting from 2004-5 to 11-12. The period between 2011-12 and 17-18 was one that was called a job loss growth. And I think people are going to run out of patience there. We've heard so many tall promises from political leaders. They will create 12 million new jobs every year. The Make in India was launched with so much fanfare that 100 million jobs will be created in the manufacturing sector by 2025. And we don't see any of that happening. I also think that, not only is this going to lead to a lot of frustration, but this idea of what we have as a good job is now going to start changing, because the labor market in the post-pandemic world is going to become increasingly informal. And this is something which has happened, empirical evidence tells us has happened in previous pandemics as well. So, the expectations of youth in terms of what kind of jobs they're going to get. Are they going to be jobs that will offer them security of tenure? Is it going to be a job that's going to offer them all kinds of available social security benefits? I think those, it's speculative, but I think that the concept of a good job is going to change, given that there is so much precarity in the labor market. And my worry is that on some level, if the youth are disillusioned that they're not going to find the kind of good jobs they think they will, this will then disincentivize investing in your education and skilling. This is something that I saw in a survey that I did of workers, where I was basically working on the manufacturing sector, which has seen an increase in the use of contract workers. And you invariably have contract workers and permanent workers working on the same assembly line, doing the same thing, but the contract worker would be getting half the wage of a permanent worker, and also very limited entitlement to any social security benefits. Most of that is anyway eaten away by the contractor. And these youth felt that, why did we invest in getting ourselves skilled or educated or taking time off from the labor market when we are going to be paid just half the wage of a regular worker? This disillusionment then impacts, I think, the education, the skilling for the next generation. And this, is definitely very harmful in the years to come.
Vivan, I also thought, I think we'll probably end after your response. We have been on for just over an hour. But in answering this question, you could also tell us a little more about your book, because I have just read a couple of the longish newspaper articles you have written. But you could also you could answer this question: what is the feeling there? I mean, what kind of frustration? I mean, slash aspiration. How I mean, how does it? How are people dealing with it? You know, educated yet unemployed or underemployed.
So first off, I'm just going to start by saying I don't think, I mean, protest on its own is not a bad thing that needs to be condemned. One of the things I find, violent protest, of course, needs to be condemned. One of the interesting things I found, there have been analyses done on those who were rioting on January 6th in Washington, D.C., the Capitol insurrection. And, lo and behold, a lot of those who were violent rioters were actually unemployed, Americans who had debts to pay and who'd been laid off. And they had all of this, all of these bills mounting, and they were completely disillusioned by the political system. And they answered the calls of a demagogue on social media and went to the temple of American democracy and did what they did. And those were all disillusioned, unemployed, largely left behind people. I'm not condoning what they did at all, but I'm just saying that, if left to fester, this is not something that's a uniquely American problem. You've seen this happen in France. You've seen it play out in the Brexit vote, and it could very well happen in India as well. So we must absolutely address this as a public safety problem and not just an economic problem. One of the really interesting things that I found in my research in the run-up to the 2019 elections, now we already had the CMI, all that NSSO data, right? The one that Somesh Jha broke in Business Standard, of 45-year high unemployment, but you didn't need that data to tell you that you have an unemployment crisis in India. You just take one trip and you see that. And plenty of the people who I was talking to who are all unemployed or hadn't had a formal job and, since they entered the workforce, I asked them, well, who are you going to vote for? And this is not to get political. I'm just saying that they were all, re-electing the incumbent. And that's what I found interesting in the Indian situation, whereas in the United States, a lot of, in 2016 and then in Brexit before that, you had a lot of Labour voters in England, and then you had a lot of Democrat voters in the US that sort of flipped their allegiances to punish the incumbent or the incumbent successor and for their situations. But in India, we were sort of rewarding the incumbent and giving them a re-election despite not actually having created those jobs. So that's a separate, discussion to be had about politics. But where it coincides with economics is that for a very long time, and I've studied this, I've read some books on this and in my own interactions, is that we have sort of dissociated economic outcomes from political administration. So a lot of people out there in the countryside will see the economy, they'll see it's not doing well, they'll see the fact that they're unemployed, but they won't blame the political system for it. Because politicians in India have never been expected to actually create jobs. They've been expected to dole out favors. They've been expected to, provide patronage and benefits to their community groups, but they've never actually been expected to create jobs. Mamata Banerjee in Bengal won election against the communists after opposing the Tata nano plant in her state. Just think about that for a second. She said, I don't want these jobs. I don't want this factory. Of course, she was, she had aligned herself with the farmers, but, a car factory creates many more jobs than those an agricultural, farm would. And she won power. The voters were like, yes, let's give power to this person who fought jobs from coming to Bengal. And, Tatas are not particularly bad employers that all of this needed to be done. And so I just cite this example to say that, in India, a lot of people don't actually blame the political system for the prevailing economic conditions in the country. But that's about jobs. Inflation is a separate story where, Mehengai is blamed on the government. And so that is obviously something that it's not a jobs question. It's a macroeconomic question that we need to always think about, because the research shows us that it's more of inflation, less actually of prevailing employment conditions. And then, to bring my book and my broader research back into this, this ultimately where I feel that, young Indians have been let down is that we are an incredibly aspirational generation. Someone in Bhopal has the same access to the world and internet as someone in Bombay and someone in Brooklyn. And so people can really see the world around them, and they know what's going on in other countries. They have access to pop culture, they have access to television, to movies in places that never had these entertainment services before. And then they see their own lives and they're like, well, I don't have any of that. And I think in 5-10 years, if the status quo continues, we're really sitting atop a tinder box where people are going to be even less financially stable, because the cost of living is only increasing. The cost of housing is only increasing. I mean, it's just, everything just seems to be getting more expensive, but jobs are not increasing. And, nothing is trickling down the way it should be trickling down. So unless, 5-10 years from now, there's a massive redistribution that takes place, which might actually be, illegal or on a scale that's almost criminal, I don't think things are really going to get better. And what I talk about in my book is actually, the aspirations of these young people, that they want desk jobs, that they want to be financially independent, but also current realities that they don't actually have that. And so again, the book's going to be out in the fall. So all of this is discussed in further detail over there. But just the final point, I tell everyone is that it all boils down to security. And so that's economic security, it's financial security, and that affects everything. It affects how you behave, it affects how you marry, it affects how you vote. And that's, unless we really control this, we might, we're setting ourselves up for a chaotic future.
I think it's time we end this. We have just been on for about 75 minutes. Thank you, Mahesh, Radhika, Vivaan. I thought it was a very intense and informative session. I mean, if I had to sum it up in, I guess, a couple of sentences, it would probably be that for India's young people, the coming decade is going to be a very challenging one. I think we could all agree on that. And a lot of what happens will depend on young people themselves, is it not? In the sense that, you'll have to create your own jobs, so to say, if there are not enough jobs. If you lack the skills and your schools and your colleges are not giving them to you, then you have to acquire them yourselves. So on the bright side, I thought I would hear a little more, but there is some of it. I mean, although the Jugaad part again, it came up, and I see Jugaad as a short-term fix for something that has for a short period you get over it by Jugaad, but it cannot be a long-term solution. And long-term solutions are the ones which are more durable. Structural changes in the economy, which can be engineered only from above. Too much regulation or poor regulation or lack of regulation. And Vivaan, you brought up a very interesting point. Yes, Bangladesh is creating jobs, but do we want to emulate Bangladesh or Vietnam or South Korea? Or should different states in India, given that we are a large country and a federal country, should different states, depending on the kind of labor force they have, go in different directions? Maybe that's the way to think ahead, because again, I mean, one could take advantage of India's federal system. And in fact, if some states are able to attract more foreign investment, some states are doing better with, let's say, health and education. Perhaps states themselves have to devise these strategies rather than wait for the central government to show them the way. Unless the central government comes in the way of states, trying out these reforms. All open-ended questions, issues. But thank you everyone who joined in. And thank you once again, Mahesh, Radhika, and Vivan, for your time and for your fantastic insights into on this topic. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.